The morning mist clung to the forest floor as I moved silently between the ancient oaks, my breath visible in the pre-dawn chill. My boots, worn from years of similar journeys, knew exactly where to step to avoid the telltale crunch of fallen leaves. The rifle in my hands was not just a tool but a connection to my past, the same model my grandfather had taught me to shoot with when I was 12 years old. These woods had been my classroom, my church, my therapist's office. I purchased my home 5 years ago specifically for this backyard view. While other buyers looked for updated kitchens or spacious master suites, I had one non-negotiable requirement: direct access to the state forest that stretched for nearly 8,000 acres behind what would become my property. The real estate agent thought I was eccentric, but she did not understand what it meant to come from 4 generations of hunters. My father had taught me that hunting was not about the kill, but about the patience, the respect for nature, and the understanding that we are part of something much larger than ourselves. My modest 3-bedroom house sat at the very edge of Oak Ridge Estates, a relatively new development that promised luxury living with nature at your doorstep. The irony was not lost on me that they advertised the forest access as a selling point while harboring residents who seemed increasingly uncomfortable with actual forest activities. Still, the first 2 years had been peaceful. I kept to myself, maintained my property meticulously, and enjoyed my weekend hunting trips without incident. Every fall, I would process my own venison in the garage, packaging enough meat to fill my freezer for most of the year. It was sustainable, ethical, and connected me to a tradition that predated supermarkets and plastic-wrapped protein. The forest provided, and I respected its gifts by using everything I took and taking only what I needed. My grandfather would have been proud to see the tradition continuing. The first sign of trouble came in the form of curious glances from neighbors when I would walk to my truck in full camouflage, rifle case in hand. Then came the whispers at community gatherings, conversations that would halt abruptly when I approached. I noticed Patricia Morrison, the HOA president, watching my comings and goings with increasing frequency, her clipboard never far from her manicured hands. Patricia had moved to Oak Ridge Estates from some upscale urban neighborhood, bringing with her a vision of suburban perfection that seemed to have no room for rural traditions like hunting. She wore power suits to check mailboxes and spoke about property values with religious fervor. Her husband, a quiet man who seemed perpetually exhausted, followed 2 steps behind her at community events, nodding at whatever she decreed. I returned from a particularly successful hunt one October evening to find an official envelope taped to my front door. The Oak Ridge Estates letterhead featured prominently at the top, followed by block letters spelling "Notice of Violation." According to the document, I had been reported for engaging in dangerous and disruptive activities that negatively impact community safety and property values. The violation cited discharge of firearms in proximity to residential areas and transportation of wildlife carcasses through common areas. A fine of $500 was assessed, due within 30 days. The signature at the bottom, written in aggressive blue ink that had nearly torn the paper, belonged to Patricia Morrison, HOA president. I stood on my front porch, reading and rereading the notice, confusion turning to indignation. The state forest was public land. I had checked and rechecked hunting regulations, obtained all proper licenses, and always stayed within designated hunting areas. The HOA had no jurisdiction over state land or wildlife management. It was preposterous. From across the street, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Patricia stood in her bay window, arms crossed, watching my reaction. When our eyes met, she did not look away or pretend to be doing something else. Instead, she raised her hand in what might have appeared to be a neighborly wave, but the slight upturn of her lips revealed it as something else entirely. A declaration. I crumpled the notice in my fist, the first shot fired in what would become a war neither of us could have anticipated. As I pushed open my front door, I could feel her eyes still on me, cataloging my every move for future violations. My hunting paradise had just revealed its serpent. The Oak Ridge Estates HOA bylaws filled 3 heavy binders that thumped onto my dining room table with satisfying weight. I had requested complete copies from the association secretary, a nervous man named Walter who seemed surprised anyone would want to read the documents in full. For 3 nights straight, I pored over every paragraph, every subsection, every footnote. My dining room became a war room, littered with highlighters, sticky notes, and legal pads filled with my increasingly agitated handwriting. Nowhere in the 846 pages of community guidelines did it mention hunting. Nowhere did it claim authority over the state forest. The jurisdiction of the HOA ended precisely at the property lines of the development. My hunting activities took place entirely on public land, under the governance of state wildlife regulations, with which I had always been in full compliance. Armed with my research and righteous indignation, I attended the monthly HOA meeting held in the community center. The room was arranged like a courtroom, with board members seated at an elevated table at the front, residents on folding chairs below. Patricia Morrison sat center, a gavel within easy reach of her French manicured fingers. The other board members, Walter the secretary, a retired accountant named Douglas, and 2 women whose names I had never bothered to learn, flanked her like loyal courtiers. When the agenda reached open floor, I raised my hand and was acknowledged with visible reluctance. I would like to address the violation notice I received regarding hunting activities, I stated, standing to face the board. The notice cites activities conducted entirely on state land, which falls outside HOA jurisdiction. Patricia leaned slightly forward, her glasses catching the fluorescent lights. Mr. Sullivan, our community guidelines clearly state that activities which negatively impact property values or community image are subject to review by the board. I opened the binder to my marked page. With respect, the guidelines specify activities on community property or private property within the development. The state forest is neither. A murmur rippled through the audience. I noticed several neighbors nodding in agreement. A man named Robert from 2 streets over caught my eye and gave a subtle thumbs up. An older woman I recognized from my morning walks smiled encouragingly. Patricia cleared her throat, silencing the room. The issue is not where you hunt, Mr. Sullivan. The issue is that you cross community property with weapons and animal carcasses, creating a disturbing spectacle for families with children. I transport all equipment in cases, as required by state law. Any harvested game is fully covered and secured in my truck bed, I countered, feeling my face grow warm. None of this violates any bylaw I could find. The board has determined that your activities fall under Section 17, Paragraph C. Behavior detrimental to community standards and aesthetics, Douglas chimed in, not meeting my eyes. That section refers to lawn ornaments and holiday decorations, I replied, flipping to the relevant page. It has nothing to do with legally sanctioned sporting activities. Patricia rapped her gavel, though there was no disorder to call to order. The board has made its decision, Mr. Sullivan. The fine stands. We suggest you find a more appropriate hobby or access the forest from a public entrance outside our community. The nearest public entrance was 20 miles away. She knew this. Everyone knew this. The weeks following that meeting brought a barrage of new violations. Suddenly, my grass was 1/4 inch too tall. My garbage cans remained visible from the street for 35 minutes after collection, exceeding the 30-minute limit. The wreath on my front door contained non-approved seasonal elements. Each violation came with its own fine, each fine with a shorter payment window than the last. I attempted compromise, proposing to access the forest before dawn and return after dusk to minimize visibility. I offered to use only a bow during certain seasons to address concerns about firearms. I even volunteered to host an educational session about ethical hunting and conservation. Each suggestion was summarily dismissed. The final straw arrived by certified mail on a Tuesday morning. A second hunting violation, this time with a $5,000 fine and language suggesting legal action if not paid promptly. My hands shook as I read the letter, not from fear but from a realization that struck me with perfect clarity. This was never about hunting. This was about control. This was about power. And Patricia Morrison was drunk on both. The clipboard tucked under my arm felt like borrowed armor as I knocked on the first door. Robert answered, recognition immediately crossing his face. His porch was impeccably maintained, yet a small citation notice was visible through his window. Apparently his American flag was 2 inches larger than regulation size. "Let me guess," he said with a tired smile. "You are also a victim of the Morrison regime." That conversation repeated itself across Oak Ridge Estates over the next week. Door after door opened to reveal neighbors harboring their own resentments. Jane Littleton had been Finn. Ed for planting non-approved native wildflowers instead of water-hungry grass. The Rodriguez family had received warnings about their children playing basketball after 6 in the evening. Elderly Mr. Chen was fighting citations for a bird feeder that allegedly attracted non-ornamental wildlife. I documented each case meticulously, filling a notebook with accounts of arbitrary enforcement and petty tyranny. The pattern was unmistakable. Those who questioned Patricia or failed to compliment her landscaping innovations found themselves under heightened scrutiny. Those who brought her baked goods or invited her to their social gatherings mysteriously had their violations overlooked. The true extent of her power became clear when I spoke with a local zoning official about filing a complaint. The board bureaucrat barely looked up from his computer. "Oak Ridge Estates, under Patricia Morrison," he shook his head. "Her husband plays golf with the mayor and half the city council. She chairs 3 community development committees. You would be wasting your time." I consulted an attorney specializing in property disputes, spending $800 I could not afford on a consultation that yielded little hope. HOAs have been granted extraordinary legal powers by the courts, the lawyer explained, leaning back in his leather chair. Fighting them is expensive, time-consuming, and the odds are not in your favor. Even if you win on the hunting issue, they will find other ways to make your life difficult. He estimated legal fees would run upwards of $20,000, with no guarantee of success. I thanked him, wrote a check that would hurt my bank account, and left with the weight of defeat pressing down on my shoulders. At home, bills began to accumulate on my kitchen table. The initial $500 fine had grown with late penalties. The $5,000 second violation loomed like an approaching storm. Legal consultation fees had drained my emergency fund. The property taxes on my home were coming due. My job as a construction site manager paid well, but not well enough to fight a war on multiple financial fronts. One evening, I found myself standing before my gun safe, running my fingers over my grandfather's old rifle. 4 generations of tradition weighed against Patricia Morrison's clipboard. Would it be simpler to just give in? sell my hunting equipment, find a new hobby that did not involve crossing invisible lines of suburban propriety. The thought left a bitter taste. My hunting gear sat in boxes by the garage door, neither put away nor taken out, existing in limbo like my resolve. That night, unable to sleep, I sat in the dark of my living room, the glow of my laptop the only illumination. I had taken to browsing real estate listings in other towns, places with more land and fewer neighbors, wondering if retreat was my only option. Scrolling mindlessly past properties I could not afford, a listing caught my eye, not for a home but for land. 800-acre forest tract for immediate sale, timber company liquidation, adjoins state forest. The description mentioned bankruptcy proceedings forcing a quick sale of undeveloped forest land. The tract bordered both the state forest and, significantly, Oak Ridge Estates. I zoomed in on the parcel map, my heart beginning to race. This was the very land I hunted on, not the state forest itself, but the private timber company land that connected it to our neighborhood. Land that had been managed for sustainable logging but otherwise left wild for decades. The asking price was astronomical for an individual, but a bargain by development standards. The timber alone would be worth a significant portion of the cost to the right buyer. My mind began calculating, spinning, connecting dots between problems and opportunities. For the first time since the certified letter arrived, I felt something other than dread and anger. A strange calm spread through me as the outline of a plan began to take shape. Not a retreat, but a counteroffensive so audacious it bordered on madness. I closed my laptop, but the blue-white afterimage of the property listing lingered in my vision like a promise. In the darkness of my living room, I made a decision that would either solve everything or cost me everything. Possibly both. If Patricia Morrison wanted to play games with property and power, I would show her what those games really looked like when the stakes were raised beyond her imagination. Morning found me at the county records office the moment it opened, requesting every available document related to the timber company property. By afternoon, I had booked an appointment with a commercial real estate agent specializing in land acquisitions. By evening, I had contacted a loan officer at my bank. The momentum of action swept away my doubts, carrying me forward on a current of determined focus. The property encompassed 827 acres of mixed hardwood forest. Purchased by Northland Timber in the 1970s and selectively harvested on a 50-year rotation. The company had maintained it as a long-term investment, taking only what could be sustainably regrown. But changing markets and corporate consolidation had forced liquidation of their smaller holdings. The land was priced to sell quickly at $2.6 million, approximately $3,100 per acre. This is an incredible opportunity for a developer, the real estate agent explained, spreading maps across her desk. With its proximity to existing infrastructure and the growing demand for luxury homes in this area, you could easily fit 200 houses on this parcel. I nodded as if considering this prospect, while internally rejecting everything about that vision. And what is the process for making an offer? The meeting with my bank loan officer was less encouraging. Gregory Allen had been handling my accounts for years and looked genuinely concerned when I outlined my intentions. "John, this is not like buying a house. Commercial land loans typically require 40% down, and even then, the bank would need to see a clear business plan for generating revenue from the property to cover the payments. At 40% down, I would need over $1 million just to start the process. My entire net worth, including my home equity, retirement accounts, and savings, totaled less than half that amount. What about investors? I asked. If I could secure additional funding from partners. Gregory's expression softened slightly. That could work, provided they bring substantial capital and you form a proper business entity to manage the acquisition. I left with a folder full of requirements and possibilities, none of them simple, all of them daunting. But the seed of the idea had taken root and was growing stronger by the hour. That evening, I began cataloging everything of value I owned. My retirement accounts could be liquidated with substantial penalties. My home had appreciated considerably since purchase and could support a large second mortgage. The collection of rare firearms inherited from my grandfather might fetch a surprising sum from the right buyer. Each item I added to the list felt like cutting away a piece of my security, my future. But the alternative, surrendering to Patricia's regime, had become unthinkable. The conversation with my sister was the hardest part. She listened in stunned silence as I outlined my plan over dinner at her house, away from potentially prying neighbors. "You want to buy an entire forest to spite the HOA lady?" she finally asked, setting down her fork. "John, that is absolutely insane. You would be risking everything Dad left us, everything you have worked for." "It is not about spite," I insisted, though perhaps it partially was. "It is about standing up for what is right, about reclaiming something that belongs to all of us but is being taken away regulation by regulation. And if you fail, if you cannot make the payments, if there are environmental issues with the land, what then?" Each question struck like a hammer, exposing the fragility of my plan. Yet I found myself defending it with increasing conviction. By the time I left her house, she had not endorsed my scheme but had promised not to actively oppose it. From my sister, this was practically enthusiastic support. Over the next 2 weeks, I approached selected neighbors, those who had shared their own HOA horror stories with me. In hushed conversations over fence lines and in the quiet corners of backyards, I presented a vision of community-controlled green space. A forest preserved for recreation, for tradition, for future generations, but with clear rules about who made those rules. Robert was the first to commit, offering to cash out an investment property. The Rodriguez family followed, willing to redirect their children's college fund temporarily with the promise of eventual return plus interest. By the end of the month, 7 households had pledged contributions ranging from $10,000 to $100,000, totaling just over $400,000. It was not enough, not nearly enough, but it was a start. The timber company accepted our initial offer, conditional upon securing financing within 60 days. The clock began ticking. I noticed Patricia watching me with increasing suspicion. My demeanor had changed from defeated to purposeful, and nothing escaped her surveillance. Twice, I caught her slowly driving past my house as I welcomed neighbors for private meetings. Once she directly questioned Robert about our sudden friendship, receiving only a vague answer about shared interests in outdoor activities. The weeks blurred together in a frenzy of paperwork, legal consultations, and financial gymnastics. I created Wildwood Conservation Trust, LLC, a corporation with myself as managing member and my fellow neighbors as silent partners. I emptied retirement accounts, accepted the penalties, and signed papers, putting my home at risk. The down payment came together dollar by desperate dollar. The closing took place on a Tuesday morning at Capital Title Company downtown. I sat at the head of a long table, signing document after document until my hand cramped. When the final paper was signed, the timber company representative slid a thin envelope across the table. "The property survey and deeds," he said. "Congratulations on your acquisition, Mr. Sullivan." I stepped out of the title company into bright sunshine, a property owner on a scale I had never imagined possible. Driving directly to the forest edge, I parked and walked into the trees that now belonged to me. The weight of financial risk pressed against my chest, nearly suffocating in its intensity. But as I touched the rough bark of an ancient oak, something else surged stronger, a wild, reckless joy. For the first time in my adult life, I owned land that no one could take from me. Land with no HOA, no Patricia Morrison, no clipboard-wielding authority figure telling me what I could and could not do. I had just made the most foolish or most brilliant decision of my life. Time would tell which. But standing there among my trees, listening to birds that now sang on my property, I could not bring myself to regret it. The surveying company arrived exactly 1 week after closing. 4 men in orange vests with tripods and electronic equipment spread out across the property line where my new forest met Oak Ridge Estates. I followed behind the lead surveyor, a gruff man named Daniels who had been mapping property boundaries in the county for 30 years. "Most people never bother with a proper survey after purchase," he commented, squinting through his equipment. "But with a parcel this size bordering residential development, it is definitely the smart move." I watched as his team hammered stakes into the ground at precise GPS coordinates, marking the true boundary of my property according to the original deeds. The work took 3 full days, during which Patricia Morrison found numerous excuses to walk her dog past the activity, her curiosity barely concealed behind large sunglasses. On the afternoon of the third day, Daniels called me over with unusual excitement in his voice. "Mr. Sullivan, you might want to see this." He pointed to his digital mapping device. "According to the original survey markers and county records, your property line extends 15 feet beyond where the development has been treating it." I followed him to the community recreation area where Oak Ridge Estates had built amenities for residents. The community pool, a small playground, and a picnic pavilion had all been constructed based on an incorrect understanding of the property boundary. Daniels placed stakes showing the true line, which ran directly through the deep end of the swimming pool, cut across one corner of the pavilion, and encompassed the entire network of nature trails the HOA had created for residents. "It appears the developers never did a proper survey when they bought their parcel from the previous owner," Daniels explained. "They just assumed the old fence line was the boundary. But according to legal records, this section belongs to your property." I maintained a neutral expression, thanking him professionally while my mind raced with implications. That evening, I called the real estate attorney who had handled the closing. "Yes, encroachment is the correct term," she confirmed after I described the situation. "If structures have been built on your property without permission, you have several legal options, including requiring their removal or negotiating easements, for compensation, of course." I requested that she prepare documentation of the encroachment but take no immediate action. "I need time to consider the best approach," I told her. She agreed, warning that I should decide before too long, as failing to address encroachment could eventually lead to claims of adverse possession. The next phase of my plan required absolute secrecy. Working with the attorney, I established Forest Haven Management Corporation, a separate entity from the initial purchase LLC. This corporation would handle all operational aspects of the property, including access rules, usage permits, and enforcement policies. Night after night, I drafted documents modeled directly on the very HOA guidelines that had been weaponized against me. Forest access regulations ran to 26 pages, detailing permitted activities, restricted behaviors, application procedures for usage permits, fee structures, and penalty schedules for violations. The language was deliberately formal, bureaucratic, and absolute, a mirror reflection of Patricia's beloved rulebook. I met with my investor neighbors individually, sharing the survey results and outlining the next steps in our strategy. Each received a proposal for exclusive access permits that would exempt them from the restrictions out to be imposed on other Oak Ridge residents. Without exception, they agreed to maintain silence until the plan was fully implemented. Robert proved particularly valuable, having served briefly on the HOA board before resigning in frustration. He provided insight into the board's procedures and vulnerabilities. Patricia runs those meetings like a dictator, but she is obsessive about following proper protocol. Everything must be on the agenda, proceed according to procedure. You can use that against her. For weeks, I lived a double life. By day, I continued to receive and seemingly ignore HOA violations. By night, I built the infrastructure of a counteroffensive. The forest property was surveyed, mapped, and divided into usage zones. Signs were ordered but not yet installed. Permits were printed but not yet issued. Everything was prepared but nothing deployed. Through it all, Patricia continued her campaign of harassment, apparently interpreting my lack of visible reaction as submission. The fines multiplied. The threatening letters increased in frequency and severity. Yet now they washed over me without effect, like rain on a waterproof coat. I noticed her growing confusion at my changed demeanor. Where she expected anger or defeat, she found only calm certainty. Twice, she engineered accidental encounters at the local grocery store, probing with loaded questions about whether I was adjusting my activities to comply with community standards. I responded with bland pleasantries that revealed nothing. The date for the quarterly HOA meeting approached, the perfect stage for what would come next. I submitted a request to be added to the agenda, citing discussion of property boundaries adjacent to community facilities as my topic. The request was approved, likely because Patricia assumed I was finally going to capitulate publicly. The night before the meeting, I laid out my presentation materials with methodical precision. Property surveys, photographs of encroachment, legal documentation of ownership, copies of the new forest access regulations, and finally, formal notices of trespass to be delivered to each board member. I selected my clothing with purpose, not my usual casual wear, but a charcoal suit I had last worn to a funeral. The message would be clear. The old, accommodating John Sullivan had died. In his place stood someone Patricia and her board had never truly met, someone who understood power and was prepared to use it. As I adjusted my tie in the mirror, I barely recognized the man staring back at me. 5 months ago, I had been a private person who wanted nothing more than to hunt in peace. Now, I was a property owner about to declare war on an entire homeowners association. The transformation should have troubled me, but instead I found myself smiling at my reflection. Patricia had taught me well. Too well, perhaps. Tomorrow would demonstrate just how attentive a student I had been. The Oak Ridge Estates Community Center hummed with unusual energy that evening. Word had somehow spread that the quarterly meeting would be more eventful than the typical drone of committee reports and maintenance updates. Chairs normally half empty were filled. Neighbors who rarely attended had made special arrangements to be present. They sensed blood in the water, though none could have guessed whose. I arrived precisely 10 minutes before the scheduled start, carrying a leather portfolio and a cardboard tube containing rolled maps. Taking a seat in the front row, I nodded politely to fellow residents while avoiding conversation. Patricia presided at the center of the board table, shuffling papers with practiced efficiency, her red blazer a beacon of authority. She acknowledged my presence with the briefest glance, her expression revealing nothing. The meeting progressed through its standard agenda items with excruciating slowness. Budget approvals, landscape committee updates, a tedious discussion about the appropriate shade of beige for exterior trim. I sat motionless through it all, my portfolio untouched on my lap, my eyes fixed on Patricia. Finally, she reached my agenda item. Next, John Sullivan wishes to discuss property boundaries. Mr. Sullivan, you have 5 minutes. I approached the podium calmly, placing my materials on its surface with deliberate care. Removing the cap from the tube, I extracted a large survey map and secured it to the easel provided. Thank you, Madam President. Fellow residents of Oak Ridge Estates, I am here tonight to clarify an important matter regarding property ownership and access rights that affect our community. The room fell silent, all eyes on the colorful boundary lines visible on my map. 8 weeks ago, I purchased the entire 827-acre forest tract adjacent to our development. I paused, allowing the magnitude of this statement to register. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Patricia's pen stopped mid-stroke. The purchase was completed through a Wildwood Conservation Trust, of which I am the managing director. I pointed to the map, tracing the property line with my finger. A professional survey conducted after purchase revealed some surprising information. The boundary between my property and Oak Ridge Estates is not where the development has historically assumed it to be. Stepping closer to the map, I indicated the red line cutting through the community amenities. According to county records and legally registered deeds, significant portions of what the HOA considers community property are, in fact, encroaching on land I now own. This includes approximately 60% of the swimming pool, the eastern corner of the pavilion, and the entirety of what you call nature trails. The room erupted in confused conversation. I stood silently, allowing the chaos to build before Patricia pounded her gavel. "This is absurd," she declared, her composure slipping for the first time in my memory. The development plans were approved by the county. Those amenities have been in place for years. Incorrect development plans based on improper surveys do not change legal property boundaries, I replied, sliding the survey certification across the table. My attorney has verified all documentation. The encroachment is clear and indisputable. Douglas, the retired accountant, adjusted his glasses to examine the survey. What exactly are you planning to do about this alleged encroachment?" His voice trembled slightly. I opened my portfolio and removed a stack of documents. Forest Haven Management Corporation, which now controls access to all 827 acres, has established comprehensive regulations governing use of the property. I held up the bound rulebook. These regulations prohibit unauthorized construction, trespassing, and use of facilities without proper permits. Walking slowly along the board table, I placed copies before each member. You will find that many of the unauthorized structures must be removed within 30 days. Additionally, all current pathways, trails, and recreation areas that cross onto my property are now closed to Oak Ridge residents pending proper permitting. The blood drained from Patricia's face as she flipped through the document. You cannot possibly enforce this. The community has established usage rights through years of. Adverse possession requires open, notorious use for a minimum of 20 years in this state, I interrupted. Oak Ridge Estates was built 11 years ago. No such claim exists. I turned to address the residents directly. Forest Haven will be implementing a permit system for access to the property. Applications will be available next week. Fees will be assessed based on type of usage, frequency, and environmental impact. The room had gone from chaotic to stunned silence. I continued, unfortunately, based on documented history of disregard for environmental regulations and harassment of conservation-minded individuals, certain residents will be categorically denied access. My eyes locked with Patricia's. This includes all current HOA board members. Robert let out a low whistle from somewhere in the back of the room. Someone else actually applauded before quickly stopping. Patricia rose to her feet, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. This meeting is not the appropriate forum for threats and intimidation. The HOA will consult its attorneys and respond accordingly. There is nothing to consult about, I replied, removing the final documents from my portfolio. These are formal notices of trespass, effective immediately. All HOA-controlled structures on my property must be removed within 30 days at your expense, or Forest Haven Management will remove them and bill the association. I placed the notices on the table and stepped back. Additionally, all fines assessed against me for legal hunting activities on what was then public land are to be rescinded and refunded within 7 days. Failure to comply will result in immediate closure of all access points between Oak Ridge Estates and my property. Douglas reached for the notice with trembling hands. This would mean tearing out the pool, the pavilion, everything the community has invested in. Yes, I answered simply, much like how your board attempted to tear out traditions and activities that predated this development. The difference is, I have legal standing for my actions. Patricia slammed her palms on the table. This meeting is adjourned. The board needs to convene in emergency session. But residents were not moving. Instead, questions erupted from all sides. Does this mean we cannot use the trails anymore? What will the permits cost? How did the HOA not know about the property line? I remained at the podium, answering calmly while Patricia and the board members huddled at their table, documents spread between them, faces growing increasingly grim as the legal reality set in. Their empire OF rules and regulations had just collided with something more powerful, actual property rights backed by county records and state law. As the meeting disintegrated into clusters of agitated conversation, I packed my materials and prepared to leave. Patricia intercepted me at the door, her voice lowered to a hiss. You will not get away with this. The association has resources you cannot imagine. I smiled for the first time that evening. So do I, Patricia. I own a forest. The weeks following the HOA meeting transformed our quiet suburb into something resembling a political campaign. Yard signs appeared overnight, some reading, "Support forest access rights," and others declaring, "Stand with the HOA." Neighbors who had exchanged nothing more than polite waves for years now engaged in heated debates at mailboxes and driveways. The battle lines were drawn not by street or block, but by philosophy, those who valued rules and property values above all versus those who prioritized freedom and tradition. The HOA attorneys sent the predicted cease and desist letters, threatening lawsuits for interference with community resources and intentional infliction of community distress. My attorney responded with detailed property surveys, historical deeds, and precedent cases supporting my position. The legal volley continued while the 30-day deadline approached. I received anonymous phone calls suggesting I would regret my actions. Patricia organized an emergency community meeting excluding me and my supporting neighbors. Rumors circulated that the HOA was considering a special assessment, essentially a tax on all homeowners, to fund legal action against me. Through it all, I maintained a calm exterior while installing security cameras and documenting every interaction. 2 weeks after the confrontation, a different kind of communication arrived, a request for a private meeting from Douglas, the board's treasurer. We met at a coffee shop 20 miles away, where he nervously stirred his drink for several minutes before speaking. "Patricia does not know I am here," he began, voice barely above a whisper. "The attorneys have given us their assessment. It is not favorable.